Um, but I have heard enough bells in the last 6 minutes that I have to quickly move on to our next speaker. And I'm going to give a very short introduction to her so we can focus more on speaking with her. In the aftermath of Rohit Vemula's tragic and hugely symbolic suicide, to my mind, one voice that blazed the trail was that of our next speaker, a young woman who simply wrote a blog talking about why she felt compelled to hide her identity as a Dalit for many years and why she was finally ready to embrace it. Of course, as expected, she got a lot of pushback for that blog, but it also went viral because it tore to shreds this abject fallacy that we live in an increasingly post-caste urban world. She has followed that blog up with a book which is recently out about her journey as an Indian Dalit woman, both material and intellectual journey. And it's a remarkable book to my mind because it makes visible that we have chosen to let remain invisible. The struggle, the trials, the tribulations, and the triumphs even of the Dalit community in this country for decades on end. Please welcome Yashica Dutt. Hi, Yashica. I just
Hi.
want to ask before we start, how many people here have read the blog that I referred to?
Those
Okay,
are my two friends in the back.
right.
They've read it.
Oh, and that's my friend in the front.
Oh,
There
he's
we
read
go.
it.
Okay, so well, given that a lot of people most people haven't read the blog, could you quickly start by telling us what the essence of the blog was and what prompted you to write it?
So first of all, in your introduction, you said my voice blazed the trail. I would say it was Rohit Vemula's death, which I hope most of us here are aware of. So I grew up as a Dalit person, as a Dalit woman. I'm sorry.
Speaking of amplifying voices, we
Totally.
literally need to do that right now.
So I grew up as a Dalit woman, and my mom's sitting in the front row. And I grew up learning how to hide my identity, how you can pass off as an upper caste person. To just put it in context, passing is an African American practice of black people in the US, African Americans who were white enough to pass off as white people because it gave them social advantages. It allowed them to not face the discrimination that comes with being black. So I found that when I moved to New York to study at Columbia, and when I read about passing, I understood that that's what I've been doing all my life, but there was no way to articulate that, or even that has not been read, that has not been studied, that has not been spoken about at all. And we are a huge country. We have so much literature, and we have so many cultural ideas, but nobody was talking about this experience that many of us have. And I went on with my life, and I thought maybe someday, when I'm a big journalist, I'm going to write a story about it, and I'll pitch it to the New York Times, and hopefully they'd be interested. And I just went on with my life trying to find work. And then I saw Rohit's story, and it was constantly on my Facebook timeline. Everybody on among my friends list, everybody was sharing that. And I knew this was important, but there's a difference in time zones, and I was busy. I just didn't read it. And also, I knew this was something I needed to engage with. It was also something I'd been putting off for a while because I was Dalit myself, and this was this young Dalit man. He'd committed suicide. I didn't know why by then. So I knew I needed to give it time. And there was this one afternoon, it was snowing outside, and I said, okay, today is the day when I'm going to see what this whole fuss is about. And I clicked on it, I clicked on the link, and the first thing I read was his suicide note. And it was poignant, and it was beautiful, and it talked about how we are all made of stardust. And it talked about and he talked about wanting to be a science writer like Carl Sagan. And I was moved not because of what his ideas, that he conveyed his ideas in the letter, but I was moved because here was a Dalit man who was writing in English. And I hadn't read any Dalit writing in English before. It's not that people haven't written, of course. It's something that I should have been educated about, but I wasn't. And that really spoke to me. And being a journalist, I decided I'm going to find out everything about who this person is. And I looked at his Facebook profile, and I recognized the photograph because it was a posthumous Facebook profile by then. And I found a photograph where he's wearing this red T-shirt, and I recognized it. I recognized the photograph. And then I remembered then a couple of days ago, I think 10 days ago, he'd sent me a friend request right before he passed away. And you can call it mistake, or maybe I'm finding too much meaning in that, but he sent me a friend request before he passed. And I liked some Dalit groups because I didn't want to come out. I wasn't ready to be open with my identity. So I'd liked some Dalit groups on Facebook, and I think he found a fellow Dalit person who's living in the US who we could share ideas with. So he reached out, but I didn't know him, so I deleted the request, and I regretted it ever since. And then when I realized and the gravity of the entire situation dawned on me, and I read about how his life was extremely difficult and how his mom worked really hard. And despite the hardships that they faced in their life, she made sure that he got educated, his siblings got educated, they got a good education. And in the Dalit community, that's extremely important. The only way forward for us, and especially because we've been denied education, upper caste systems have kept us away from being educated for so long. So education is the only way forward for a lot of us. And I saw that similarity between our lives, and I realized that that life could have been mine. Only if my parents didn't push me to be educated, to pass off as an upper caste person, to learn to speak really good English, to learn to write really well, to become a journalist. If I didn't have these key differences, I could have been that person, except he wasn't hiding his identity. I was. Despite all the hardships that he had, which I didn't. I was at Columbia sitting in a beautiful cafe in New York, and he died in a hostel room in Hyderabad. And that really spoke to me, and I said, okay, life's been hard, and I've been hiding my identity, but what am I doing with everything that I have now? I have skill, I have knowledge, and I have the resources, which is the internet. And I decided that I'm going to start a Tumblr. Tumblr is a media site, where you can just write posts. It can be a blog. So I thought I'll start a blog. It was called Documents of Dalit Discrimination. And I wanted to invite people to talk about their lives and their stories, especially people like me who'd spend their lives in hiding, because a lot of us do. And I was aware that a lot of Dalits change their last names, pretend to be upper caste, because we don't want to go through that discrimination. But I realized that I can't invite anybody to talk about their story unless I did that. So it was really important for me to first come out as a Dalit person. And once I made that decision, it was easy. Also, I was excited because I passed so skillfully. Nobody thought I was Dalit. Nobody I worked with, most of my friends, nobody I'd gone to college with knew I was Dalit. So I was excited because all these people were about to find out just with that one Facebook note. And I wrote up this note on Facebook, and I shared my story about what Rohit Vemula's death meant for me, and why I decided to come out Dalit, and how it was my decision. Nobody was going to find out who I was. I was about to declare my identity, and I was about to draw power from that move. I was not going to allow anybody to say, we found out what your real caste is, and we are going to embarrass you for that, or we are going to make you feel ashamed. I realized that there is power in my history and power in the oppression that, as a community, we have been through. And that's why I wrote the blog post.
There's a lot that you've said in there, and I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit, except that we have very little time again. But a couple of things that I found very, very interesting is, people keep talking about how race and caste don't actually exactly equate, and it's not something that I disagree with, but I find it very interesting that you found inspiration from the African American movement and writing to be able to find a way to understand what you have been through and and articulate what your community has been through as well. You also use the phrase coming out, which is often associated with sexual minorities, and these were very, very intriguing and very interesting, and I would like to imagine deliberate choices that you made. We'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to first address something else very quickly, which is that in the beginning that you said that the first thing that struck you about Rohit's note and his writing is that he was writing in English, and that spoke to you directly. I want to, and I know this can be, I hope you will be able to answer it succinctly. What do you see as milestones in your journey of self-awareness and of understanding your own history and your own experience and that of your community through studying and understanding Dalit history, particularly Baba Saheb Ambedkar's works, his writings, and his journey as well, not just what he's written, but what he went through?
Um, so when I was in school and when I went to I went to St. Stephen's, and I think that's important for me to say because it's really difficult to imagine people that a Dalit person might go to Stephen's as well. So I just wanted to underline that. When I was in school and college, I was not thinking about being Dalit as I was thinking about hiding the fact. So there were no milestones as far as that was concerned. And as the years passed, and I worked at HT and I worked at Asian Age before that, and I grew comfortable with who I was, which means that I grew comfortable with lying well. I grew comfortable with people understanding that I was upper caste, and when somebody asked what my caste was, I was able to lie that much more effectively. So I was also getting very comfortable in my role of being an upper caste passing Dalit person. So there were no milestones as far as that was concerned. The first time I was forced to think about what my real identity was when I was applying for Columbia. And they had an essay, they have an essay question about what do you have to talk about your identity? Tell us about who you really are. And I thought, and I realized that there was no way for me to be honest unless I acknowledged my Dalit history. So that was the first time I spoke about how my great-grandfather was denied education. He was not allowed to go to school. And even when he managed to somehow get an admission in school, and that was just like 3 generations ago, it wasn't that long ago, he was forced to learn how to read and write by scrawling in the mud with a stick. He was not allowed to hold a slate because I'm sure, as most of us are aware, Dalits weren't allowed to touch objects that are associated with education, pencils, books, slates. So when I first typed that story, I realized that this is something I should be taking pride in. There is a lot to be proud of over here. This is something that I've never acknowledged about myself, where I come from. And I felt really good. That was the first time in 2013 I realized that maybe there is nothing for me to be embarrassed about who I am. But I obviously did nothing about that because, I was going off to college and that was important. Then the second awakening came when I was at Columbia and we took courses in feminist theory, and I was in a classroom and everybody, again the identity question because it's a relevant idea. And everybody was talking about what identity meant for them, and there were queer students, there were African American students, there were Latino women, and everybody was talking about their experiences. And I thought, okay, I'll talk about my caste and like how we do. I mean, in casual circles, everybody's asking you what your caste is. So I talked about how Dalits have been discriminated, how the system exists, and how I've been hiding. And that was the first time that I saw shock on people's faces when I described this entire process. Before that, I mean, of course, I discussed it in minor ways with some people I knew, some friends. But of course, being Indian and being in the context that we are, there's nothing shocking about the caste system. But to those foreign students, they were from all over the world, what I saw on their faces was pure shock. And then I realized, wow, I've been going through this experience all my life, realizing how this was completely normal when it wasn't. And that was the second time when I realized that this is something I should acknowledge more powerfully than I do now. And then, of course, coming out, when I decided that I am going to be completely honest about who I am, and I'm not going to live in fear anymore. I'm not going to live in the fear of being found out that I was upper caste, and I'm going to own my story. I'm going to be the narrator myself. And after that, I started reading more about Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and I hadn't read any Ambedkar text till I was 30. And I'm not ashamed to say that, because when Dalits read Ambedkar, when Dalits associate with Ambedkar, there are grave consequences to that. There is a young man in Maharashtra who had his ringtone as a Baba Sahib tune, and he was killed. So the Dalits deliberately stay away from Ambedkar, and I did too. But when I was out, I understood his journey. I didn't even know he went to Colombia. I didn't know he had a statue in the library that I spent hours in. So I was reading his work, and I remember when I was researching Annihilation of Caste for the book, and after every page, I was like, yes, this is how it should be, because his writing was so powerful and so direct, and it really means something to hear that Dalits are absolutely equal. There is no difference between you and any other caste. No matter what people tell you, and a lot of sects of Hinduism, a lot of, not even religions, in fact, a lot of ideas will tell you, okay, to do manual scavenging is to do God's work. Like how they try to spin the idea that caste is okay, but how else will you divide the society? The justifications around caste, and somehow as Dalits we accept them. But when I read Ambedkar, he said, this is wrong, and I am not going to accept that. And that was an extremely powerful moment for me. And like I said, I was alone in my room just shouting yes after every 5 minutes, because that's when I realized this is who we are, this is who I am, and now there's no going back.
One of the things that you mentioned about hiding your caste, right? I want to come back to that for a second, because, and again, I don't want to indulge in any sort of oppression Olympics or, any such thing. But somewhere, the fact that you were living in Delhi or you were living in the US, right? And it's a horrible thing to have to do, to hide your identity. So I'm not taking away from your experience for a second. But at the same time, the fact that you were in Delhi or you were, helped you, become a false, manufacture a false self, however painful that might have been. My family, my ancestral village is near Ayodhya. My relatives still live there. And there is no way that you can hide, even think about hiding your caste there, right? I mean, your entire kasbas are divided according to caste. They're actually called by caste, right? This is Kurmi. I mean, there is no other name for the village. It is a Kurmi village, it is a Chamar village, it is a Brahman village. There is no way you can escape your identity, right? And this somehow, this difference, this critical difference, somehow leads a lot of people into thinking that urban India is increasingly post-caste, right? which it is not when you listen to Yashica, when you listen to a young woman who felt compelled to not tell people who she was, who felt compelled to lie about who she was, and how painful that experience and isolating that experience might have been. Yashica, I wanted you to talk about this fallacy of a post-caste urban India and how it manifests itself. And perhaps because we're very short of time, you could also try and help me link that up with the projection of Dalits in the media and how the fact that they are, I mean, grossly underrepresented in the media, in movie making, in these vital representation industries, how that sort of fuels this fallacy of a post-caste urban India?
That's a great question. And I just, people talk about it a lot, that India is post-caste. When I don't understand, we're still fighting about reservation. What is reservation based on? It's based on caste. So how are we able to say confidently that India is anywhere post-caste when 10% reservation is a hot topic as far as a couple of weeks ago? And whenever you mention reservation for Dalits, the first remark that you hear is, you don't deserve it, you're talentless, you're meritless. So when you're hearing ideas like that all the time, especially when you're a Dalit person, how am I supposed to believe that urban spaces are post-caste? Let's look at our house helpers, people who come and collect our garbage. Are we ever going to touch them? I mean, people who, I'm sure a lot of us have employees who collect our garbage. Are we going to allow them to enter our kitchens? Are we going to allow them to cook food for us, people who clean our bathrooms? Are we going to let them manage the entire house? I don't suppose we are going to let them do that. And that itself shows that India is not post-caste. In the US, we clean our own bathrooms. And then there is no sense of someone else is going to come and do it for us. And there maybe you can create an argument. You can say, okay, caste is invisible, whereas Indians still keep it alive wherever they go. So, I mean, that's a separate discussion altogether. But urban spaces in no way are post-caste because universities exist in cities. We have people who come and manage our homes in cities. It's in cities that we ask the question of what caste certain persons from, or what caste are they getting married into. It's in cities that we give ads in matrimonial sections saying that we want a fair, slim, Brahmin girl who doesn't work and is not a feminist. So this happens in cities. And we are not post-caste in any way.
And I would urge all of you who are listening to this to just do one simple thing when you get home, which is look at the statistics of, there are unfortunately no statistics on how many house helpers and people who clean drains and etc., manual scavengers are Dalits. It's safe to assume most of them are, but there are very good statistics on how many Dalits are there in the media, how many Dalits are there in filmmaking, how many Dalits are there in the art world. There are very good statistics and they will shock you. So I would urge you to go home and look at those statistics. I have them here, but I don't have the time to read them out to you. But I want to, you mentioned, people who clean bathrooms, and that obviously leads us to the intersection of caste and class, right? And you have written, you've written a lot in your book about the absolutely, I have no adjectives for the lives and the deaths of those who are forced to clean our drains. And I say forced because they have no economic choices. It is modern day slavery, really. When we have the technology, I mean, we were sitting here talking about technology in manufacturing, et cetera, the technology to get rid of this absolutely evil practice of having people to go down into drains and clean them manually exists. It's just not being used. You've written about them. So could you talk a little bit more about the oppression on that intersection before we move on to gender, because we're, I think, running out of time?
So before we move on to that, I just want to say caste and class are not the same thing. I can tomorrow be very rich. I am not now, but I hope to be when the book sells. Uh, but I don't think the discrimination will stop. And the discrimination hasn't stopped for many of us. Tina Dabi, who was the IS top a couple of years ago, faced extreme discrimination and trolling both online and in real life. So you can transcend class, but you can't transcend caste, especially in an Indian context. So that clearly explains how caste and class are entirely different. But there are people who live on that intersection. Manual scavengers, like we just spoke about, house helpers, people who collect our garbage, who have no economic choices because their families have been doing that same profession and they have no way out of that life. They have no options to move out of there. Sure, they can go to school, sure, they can go to college, but they will always be that person's son who goes to collect garbage from house to house. So that really limits your options in that sense. But beyond that, we also have landless laborers, Dalit women in particular, who, especially in rural areas, they don't have access to land, they don't have access to jobs, they don't have access to opportunities. And they go out and work in other people's fields and they get paid less, way less than even Dalit men do. Like for example, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think manual scavenging can get you about 1,000 rupees a month, which is dismal because a drink here can cost you more. But a woman who collects human excreta on her head through a jute basket, and when it rains, it pours on her face, she gets 300 rupees a month. So, that's the real intersection of caste and class when we talk about Dalit women are at the bottom of it. And this is not to create a rift because I think it's really important to talk about contexts here, but it is really essential to address that if Dalit men have it bad, Dalit women have it even worse. And at that intersection of caste, class, and gender is where Dalit women lie, and most of them, especially if they're in rural spaces, have no way out of it.
You had mentioned that I wish we had a little bit more time to talk about how we have a very rich history of feminism in this country, but unfortunately, it's mostly been Savarna feminism. It's actually entirely been Savarna feminism, and like you've correctly pointed out, even if grudgingly, there is the space for Dalit women within the Indian feminist movement is increasing. Very quickly, before we close, because we've already spoken about intersection, I would like to go back to something that you've brought up a couple of times now, which is reservations. And I'd like your opinion on two things very quickly. One is the creamy layer exception. That is, something that a lot of people in the country, particularly the ruling party currently, and the RSS is a proponent of. And of course, the 10% reservation for economically backward classes that has just been, in the news as well. Quick opinions on that. I'm sorry to have to ask you to rush this, but the bell has already been rung.
I am a journalist, so I'll rush through it.
Thank God.
So it's very important to understand what reservation is. It's not a handout. It's not a finance policy. It's not a scholarship scheme. It's an affirmative action program to try to undo thousands of years of discrimination, of keeping Dalits as untouchables, of denying them access to basic education, of making sure that if they show any signs of wealth, pride, vanity, we're going to murder them. So that is what reservation aims to undo. Because unlike upper caste people, which is non-Dalits, Dalits don't have an entry into, let's say, private reservation. And I wish I could talk more about that, but you just have to buy the book. When we don't have access to education for generations, we don't know how do you prepare for an exam. For example, when my great-grandfather was preparing for the IAS, because that's all you did if you wanted to rise in life or have a life if you were Dalit, he didn't know where to start. Whereas if somebody who has had bureaucrats in their family for generations has knowledge capital, that's the essential difference between Dalits and people who've had that kind of privilege for generations. So reservations, as far as creamy layer is concerned, in my opinion, is a moot point. Because what creamy layer are we talking about? And I can only speak for Dalits. OBCs are a completely different section which I claim no authority on. But even like I mentioned briefly earlier, you can become a really high-ranking officer and your subordinates will not respect you because you're Dalit. So is that creamy layer? What about that kind of discrimination? And that discrimination will not stop. No matter how much money you earn, Dalit businessmen who earn in millions still don't get the same respect as somebody who is a middle-class businessman. So I reject that idea personally. And quickly coming to the 10% reservation by the current government. So they don't have many options, right? They can't take away SC/ST reservation. They can't do anything for OBC reservation. So they have to create this new identity for the 10% upper castes. Because, that's how India flourishes, by creating new identities. And they've created this 10% quota. I'm just excited to see who's going to be the quota wale now. Because we've been the quota wale forever, right? Like, these are the people who don't have merit. These are the people who don't have talent. So are those upper castes, like a Brahmin, economically underprivileged person, is that person going to be called quota wale, or still we remain people who have grabbed that seat that we don't deserve? So that's something I'm really excited to see. I just think it's, I wish Dalits had any power, but we don't. But reservations are strictly affirmative action, but the government will do what it does. I'm just curious to see how it goes.
Thank you very much, Yashica. There is a lot more, and trust me, a lot more that I wish I could have spoken to her about, but she's written a wonderful book. It is very clear, very honest, and for the topic that she's dealing with, a very easy read. I recommend that you buy it and get her to sign it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yashica.